This is a moment that could reshape the entire trajectory of the conflict between the United States and Iran. And honestly, most Americans have no idea just how fast things are moving right now behind closed doors. So let me walk you through everything that has happened in the last 24 hours because it is significant, it is serious, and it directly impacts your life, whether you realize it or not. Reports have now confirmed that Iran has reached out directly to the United States through a diplomatic back channel. And this is not speculation. This is coming from senior officials familiar with the matter who say that Iran's foreign minister personally contacted the American special envoy, Steve Witkoff. And that tells you something really important about where Iran's head is at right now. Because for years, decades even, Iran has publicly refused to engage in any kind of direct negotiation with Washington. They have always used intermediaries. They have always gone through third parties. And now suddenly they are picking up the phone themselves. And that shift did not happen by accident. That shift happened because the pressure campaign is working and they are feeling it in ways they have not felt before. President Trump addressed this directly and said something that really stood out. He said, they are negotiating and we always talk. Somebody asked him, would you even talk to them? And he said, why would I not talk to them? I talk to everybody. Sometimes good things come out of it. And then he added something that was very revealing. He said, I do not know if they are ready yet, but they are taking a pounding. And that phrase right there, they are taking a pounding. That is not just rhetoric. That is a reflection of what is actually happening on the ground and in the air, because the United States military has systematically dismantled key elements of Iran's defense infrastructure over the past several weeks, and the results are undeniable. But here is where the story gets even more intense. And I need you to pay close attention because overnight there was a major development that has sent shockwaves through the Iranian political establishment. Reports have confirmed that Ali Larijani, one of the most prominent political figures inside Iran, a man who has served as Speaker of Parliament, a man who has been a presidential candidate, a man who sits at the very center of Iran's internal power structure, was directly targeted in an overnight operation. And as of right now, his condition has not been confirmed. We do not know if he survived. We do not know the full extent of what happened. But what we do know is that this strike sends an unmistakable message to every single person in Tehran's leadership that no one is beyond reach. No one is untouchable. And the days of operating with impunity are over. And this raises a question that even the President of the United States himself has acknowledged is difficult to answer. Who is actually in charge in Iran right now? Because the traditional power structure that most people think of when they think of Iran, the supreme leader, the president, the foreign minister, that is only part of the picture. And according to experts who have spent their careers studying the internal dynamics of the Iranian regime, there is essentially a state within a state, a shadow government that operates the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And this inner circle is reportedly made up of roughly 4,000 individuals who do not answer to the president of Iran. They do not answer to the foreign ministry. They answer to one person and one person only, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the supreme leader. And what we are told about this group is deeply concerning because they are described as being driven by anger and a burning desire for revenge. They are not pragmatists. They are not diplomats. They are ideologues who believe that any compromise with the United States is a betrayal of everything they stand for. And that creates an incredibly dangerous dynamic because you essentially have two competing power centers inside Iran right now. You have the diplomatic wing that is reaching out to Washington, trying to find an off-ramp. And you have this hardline military establishment that would rather see the entire region go up in flames than sit down at a negotiating table. And the question that nobody can answer with certainty is which side will win that internal battle. Now, let me bring this closer to home because I know a lot of Americans are watching this and thinking, okay, this is happening thousands of miles away. Why should I care? And the answer is simple. Look at the price you paid the last time you filled up your gas tank, because for only the second time in history, the national average price of gasoline in the United States has exceeded $5 a gallon. $5. And that is not a coincidence. That is a direct consequence of what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now. And if you are not familiar with why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much, Let me explain it in the simplest terms possible. It is a narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, and roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through it every single day. It is the most important choke point for global energy, and whoever controls that strait has enormous leverage over the entire global economy. And right now, Iran is using that leverage. They are threatening to shut it down. They are making it dangerous for commercial shipping, and the ripple effects are being felt at every gas station in America. President Trump has been very clear about this. He is pushing hard to build an international coalition to keep the Strait of Hormuz open and protect commercial shipping. And he has been on the phone with leaders around the world, making the case that this is not just America's problem, this is everybody's problem. And he said something really interesting about those conversations. He said numerous countries have told him they are on the way. Some are very enthusiastic about joining the effort, but then he added that some are not enthusiastic at all. And here is the part that clearly frustrated him. He pointed out that some of the countries that are reluctant to help are countries that the United States has been protecting for years, countries where we have tens of thousands of American soldiers stationed to keep them safe. And he said the level of enthusiasm matters to him. And you can hear in his voice that he is taking note of who steps up and who does not, because this is a moment of truth for a lot of these international relationships. And the early returns are not great, because Germany has already said they will not send ships to the region. Italy has said the same thing. And Japan, a country that depends heavily on oil that flows through that very strait, has also declined to participate. And that has to be incredibly frustrating for the administration, because these are wealthy, capable nations with modern navies, and they are essentially saying, we will let American sailors take all the risk while we enjoy the benefits. And at some point, that equation has to change, because it is simply not sustainable for the United States to bear the entire burden of global security while other nations free ride on our sacrifice. When the president was asked directly why the United States cannot just reopen the strait on its own, he gave a very honest answer. He said we could, but it takes two to tango. These ships are very expensive. They can cost up to $2 billion each. And he acknowledged that there is real risk involved, but said he thinks it will be okay. And that balance between confidence and caution is exactly what you want from a commander-in-chief in a situation like this, because you do not want someone who is reckless, and you do not want someone who is paralyzed by fear. You want someone who understands the stakes and is willing to act while also being realistic about the challenges. Now, there is another dimension to this story that does not get nearly enough attention, and it involves China. Because while the United States is spending billions of dollars and putting American lives at risk to keep the Strait of Hormuz open for global commerce, China is quietly benefiting from the chaos in a way that is absolutely infuriating. When you really think about it, Iran is currently shipping between 1 and 2 million barrels of oil per day to China at a steep discount. China is getting cheap oil while the rest of the world is paying record prices. And here is the part that should make every American angry. Chinese tankers are passing through the Strait of Hormuz to pick up that discounted Iranian oil while other nations are being blocked or threatened. So the United States is essentially providing security for a shipping lane that China is exploiting to buy cheap oil from the very country we are in conflict with. And there is a growing conversation in Washington about whether that should be allowed to continue, because if we are the ones keeping that strait open, why should we let Chinese tankers benefit from our protection while China does nothing to help and actively undermines our sanctions by buying Iranian oil? It is a legitimate question, and it is one that is going to get louder and louder as this conflict continues. And speaking of Asian nations, there is a broader point here that needs to be made. The countries that rely most heavily on oil from the Middle East are not in North America. They are in Asia, Japan, South Korea, India, and of course, China. These nations depend on that oil for their economies to function. And yet, when President Trump asked them to contribute to the security of the shipping lanes that carry their energy supplies, most of them say, no, thank you. And that imbalance has been going on for decades, but it is becoming impossible to ignore now, because American taxpayers are footing the bill for a military operation that primarily benefits countries on the other side of the world who refuse to share the burden. Now, I want to take a step back for a moment and talk about the bigger strategic picture here because there is a school of thought among foreign policy analysts that says Iran's primary strategy is not to defeat the United States militarily. They know they cannot do that. Iran's strategy is to outlast Washington, to drag this out, to make it so expensive and so exhausting that eventually American political will collapses and we pull back. And the way they do that is through economic pressure, through oil disruptions, through attacks on shipping, through driving up gas prices, through making the American public say, enough is enough. We cannot afford this anymore. And that is exactly why this moment is so important, because if the United States pulls back prematurely, if we let the economic pain push us into a premature withdrawal, the consequences would be catastrophic. Iran would emerge from this conflict more powerful than before. Their missile technology would continue to advance, their accuracy would improve, and they would use that military capability to blackmail not just the United States, but every nation in the Persian Gulf. And at that point, the cost of dealing with Iran would be 10 times what it is today. But here is the thing that I think is really important for people to understand. And I say this not to minimize the challenges, but to put them in proper perspective. The problems we are facing right now are addressable. They are solvable. The United States military has been aware of these risks for a long time. The Pentagon has contingency plans for exactly this kind of scenario. And while wars do not always go in a straight line, while there is always an ebb and flow, while there will be setbacks and difficult days, the fundamental balance of power has not changed. The United States still has the most capable military force on the planet, and we have already demonstrated that by systematically degrading Iran's ability to project power. One of the key strategic points in this entire conflict is a place called Karg Island, and most Americans have probably never heard of it. But it is arguably the most important piece of real estate in this entire conflict because Karg Island is where the action is when it comes to Iranian oil exports. It is the central hub, the loading point, the place where Iranian oil meets the global market. And whoever controls Karg Island essentially controls Iran's economic lifeline. And here is the significant part. The United States has already taken out Iran's military aircraft capability in that area. The air defense systems that were supposed to protect Karg Island are gone. And what remains is primarily the oil infrastructure itself. And that gives the United States an enormous amount of leverage because at any moment, if the decision is made, that infrastructure could be neutralized and Iran's ability to export oil and fund its military operations would be severely crippled. I think we were somewhat conditioned by what happened recently in other situations where things moved very quickly and resolved almost overnight. And that created an expectation that every conflict would follow the same pattern. But Iran is different. Iran is a large country with a significant military capability. They have invested decades in building up their defense systems, their missile programs, their proxy networks, and dismantling all of that takes time. It takes patience. It takes sustained pressure. And the American public needs to understand that this is not going to be wrapped up in a weekend. This is a long-term strategic challenge that requires resolve and commitment. So where do things go from here? Well, there are really two tracks running simultaneously right now. There is the military track where operations are continuing and the pressure is intensifying. And there is the diplomatic track where Iran has now opened a direct line of communication with the United States. And the question is whether those two tracks can converge into some kind of resolution, because the ideal outcome here is not an endless war. The ideal outcome is a situation where Iran comes to the table and agrees to verifiable, enforceable terms that address their nuclear program, their missile development, their support for proxy groups, and their threats to international shipping. And the fact that they are reaching out directly for the first time suggests that at least some elements within the Iranian government understand that the current path is unsustainable. But whether the hardliners who control the military will allow the diplomats to make a deal, that is the million-dollar question. And it is one that nobody can answer with certainty right now. What I can tell you is this: the next few weeks are going to be absolutely critical. The decisions that are made in Washington and Tehran over the coming days will determine whether this conflict escalates further or begins to wind down. And every American should be paying attention because this affects our national security. It affects our economy. It affects the price we pay for everything from gasoline to groceries. And it will shape the geopolitical landscape for years and potentially decades to come. So stay informed, stay engaged, and understand that what is happening right now is not just another news cycle. This is a defining moment in American foreign policy, and its outcome will be felt by every single one of us.